My name is Helen Lisowski, and I'm going to be talking about playing the chaos lottery. Now, the first thing I need to explain is chaos in this scenario is anyone here familiar with the idea of Chaos Monkey as a software package? Okay, so apparently sysadmins have this Chaos Monkey package which allows them to simulate a cheeky monkey running around randomly unplugging bits of kit to see how resilient their systems are. So this wasn't the original name for this idea, and you'll hear more about that later. But when I'm talking about chaos, it's this idea. It's about resilience within the team. Okay, so this is an experimental talk. So I'm just telling you up front. I'm going to be telling you a story. A lot of the story is going to be talking about an idea I had, and it'll tell you the background of where I got the idea from, why I think it's really important, and outline how you could do it, how you could run it. And at the very end, I'll tell you a little bit more about a story about real life. Okay? There will be some room, quite a lot of room at the end, for questions. And I will be asking your opinion during this. So please do just give me some answers, otherwise I'll be stood here on my own. So let's talk about a normal story arc. When you're telling someone a story, usually when someone stands up and is talking about an experience report at a conference, they're telling you about this thing happened at work. Here's a thing that happened. And somebody somewhere has this brilliant idea for how we can solve the thing that happened. And what we then do is we get the experience report about here's what happened when we tried the idea. There was an outcome to it. Which is fine. Normally between steps 1 and 2, you end up with this part of the world that we never really visit, which is the hindsight. So between something happening and someone having this great idea, someone says, God, if only we'd known about that in advance. This is my personal favorite. I've actually been there when they've said, we've identified this risk. And somebody else says, it's okay, go and write it on the risks and issues log. And my argument to that is, and then what? What are you going to do with it when you've written it down? It doesn't make it go away. My perennial favorite here, I could have told you that would happen. Really? Really, you could have told me and you didn't? Why did you not tell me that could happen? So, my story arc is slightly different. So this is about where I had an idea and then a thing happened. Okay, and then we got an outcome. So I've told you most of the talk is about this top one, I had an idea. And I'll talk to you about what happened and the outcome afterwards. So, has anyone read this book? You've read it? Oh, the first person ever to tell me they've read this book before me. I loved this book too. It's about a guy called Chris Hadfield, who is an astronaut. He was the astronaut who went onto the International Space Station and played Space Oddity from space. But he was a bit of a hero of mine before that, because when he came back to Earth, he wrote this book, and this book is largely about his life, and he spends a lot of the time in this book explaining how he grew up since the age of 7 or 8, desperately wanting to be an astronaut in Canada, where they had no space program. And throughout his life, he had to make choices about what he was going to do next with his career and with his life, and yet he wanted to be an astronaut in Canada with no space program. So every decision he made along the way, he made specifically to make sure that he was aiming for the right place. Should suddenly he get an opportunity to be an astronaut, he wanted to be ready. And I loved that idea of being ready and adaptable. That's kind of the core of what we aim for in Agile, isn't it? Ready, but adaptable for whatever. So an end goal, we're aiming for that, but we don't know how we're going to get there. We're going to iterate. So, as part of the byproduct of this book and him telling his life story, I can't recommend it enough if you haven't read it, is he talks about his time at NASA, because he did, ironically, get selected to go into the space program. So he ended up working with NASA. And whilst he's talking there, and whilst he's there, he obviously understands about all the different flight manuals and such like that they have. So he talks about his time at NASA, and NASA, when they're training their astronauts, talk about before they sent anyone into space, they still had to come up with ways of training astronauts to go into space when they'd never done it before. So they thought of all the things that could possibly go wrong, and they trained their teams for that, which seems like a really great idea. And they started to build flight manuals, vast chunks of literature for everything they could imagine that would happen. And then once they started sending astronauts into space with the Apollo programs and all the rest of it, they also started to add on everything that ever did happen. So if something new happened, they built a new bit of the manual. So they have these procedures. So every astronaut to this day is trained on everything that they could imagine happening, anything has ever happened ever. And of course, they still need to train people on things that they can't possibly imagine will happen. You don't know what it is you don't know. So how do you prepare your astronaut 125 miles up to be ready? So NASA have this idea, and Chris Hadfield talks about it in his book, of death sims. Now, ironically, this was the original title of this talk, and apparently, death sims is not an encouraging topic, I was told, and I was advised strongly to change it. So there's a lot of death and destruction in this. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I do apologize, but at the same time, death sims in NASA work a bit like this. So they have all sorts of scenarios and simulations that they do, and they practice and practice and practice. But every now and again, they do something called a death sim, and it involves everybody who could possibly be involved. And it works a bit like this. So Agile Chris walks into the office with, Astro Chris, not Agile, maybe it is. Astro Chris walks into the office with Astro Pete and Astro Jen and says, okay, what are we doing today? So, well, we're going to do a death sim. Yay, it means we go home early on a Friday. Great. So what happens is they say, well, okay, so start. And it's like, what do you mean start? So they start and they say, okay, well, we're going to be doing a normal set of procedures. So we do some science, we do some exercise, we do all the things that are built into a normal day. And they are scheduled massively in NASA. You don't want too much downtime as an astronaut because you're in a tin can in the middle of space. You don't want to have time to think too much. Come in, sit down. That's okay. So what happens is, Astro Chris comes in and says, right, so today then I am going to start doing whatever's scheduled for me on the roster, as is Astro Pete and as is Astro Jen. Great. Then I need to explain, this is really like an artist's representation of how I envisage it working, because, you know, I'm fairly sure they don't have a games master. But I imagine the games master who throws down a card on the table that says, hey, Astro Chris, you're feeling a little unwell. You've got a bit of a headache. So Astro Chris says, right, okay, to deal with that, I need to take a couple of paracetamol. I'll be fine. But because the procedures in the flight manual say, actually what I need to do is make sure that Astro Pete, who's our medic on board, knows that I've taken some kind of medication. I'll follow procedure and do that. So they start doing this. Astro Pete, what are you going to do? Well, I've recognized that Chris has taken this. I'm off to do some science. Astro Jen's going to go and do her 2 hours exercise. Next card comes down from the games master. What are you going to do, Chris? Chris, you're feeling distinctly unwell. You're slipping in and out of consciousness now. What are you going to do? And Chris says, I don't know. I'm going to do. I'll go and lie down, shall I? So Astro Pete says, right, what are you going to do? They say, what are you going to do, Astro Pete? He says, right, okay, as the medic on board, I will follow procedure and I will alert ground control. Astro Chris is not well. I'll start doing some tests because, firstly, I want to know, is this contagious? Because, you know, I don't want to go down with whatever he's got. Could it be something toxic leaking into the systems? So they go away, they start doing some tests on Astro Chris. Astro Chris, taking a turn for the worst, is now dead, unfortunately. However, there's still problems to be done. What are they going to do with the body? They need to alert his wife. His wife is hiking in the mountains in the Rockies with no cell phone. What are ground control going to do? Actually, we're going to dispatch somebody to go and find her and tell her. Okay, that's great. So the games master then says, well, that's good because somehow the media have got wind of this, and there's a journalist camped outside Chris's school, kids' school, and they want to talk to the kids about how they feel about their dad being in danger. What are you going to do about that? So the idea is they don't know what's going to happen, and this games master, as I call him in my head, is busy throwing out these cards. And the idea is about helping the team adapt to things that, dear God, they should never have to adapt to. So I read this and a little light bulb went on in my head and I thought, we should test teams. We should test teams to see how they do, because we have our own set of in-flight manuals. We have these kind of things. And this was just a random set that I came up with. We have lots of them, just like NASA do, not probably as many. But we do test-driven development. We do solid principles with our code. Dev test pairing we do. Regular code check-ins. Information radiator, housekeeping. These are procedures that we go through because we know they make the world better. And if we keep doing them, we all know roughly where we'll be. So, how disciplined are we with this stuff? That was my question. We say we do this. How do we do it? So the first thing I had to do was rebrand it, as I said, Chaos Lottery. Death Sims, you'll see later when I show you the cards, not so much of a winning formula. But I wanted to know what would happen. The principle of this idea was to take it and say, what would happen if we took a developer out of a team suddenly, with no notice? What are you going to do? A tester out of a team with no notice. How do you think your teams would cope? Okay, so we look at these, we say, these should help us. These are our in-flight manuals. These kind of things, and there are hundreds, these kind of things should help us. But you know what? You don't want to test for a day, because we could manage for a day. Probably. We could manage for a couple of days. Because you get a developer off sick, it's not a problem. You just park the work, it'll be fine, we'll catch up by the end of the sprint. But what happens if it's a bit longer, it's a little bit more uncomfortable? It needs to be a week or two. You know, it's quite feasible that a developer would get struck by chickenpox, and bless them, their children have shared, and they are off work for 2 or 3 weeks. It's feasible. It's not likely, but you know, how resilient is your team? So that was my idea, and that's where I came from. So we had some problems to solve. This was the first one. I wanted to get everybody when they came into the office. So this is, I'm going to move on to actually how you'd physically run this. When they came into the office, you were going to get a card to say, bang, you're dead. And apparently, it needed a rethink. I can't imagine why. So woohoo, you're a lottery winner was apparently better received. I reckon we had about 12, I know, imagine. We had about 12 teams. I wanted to try this with 4. So that was the number. 4-ish, you need to do enough that then when you get them together, they can form a temporary team. Because otherwise, as we'll talk about in a minute, they've got to have something to do. You need a planned activity for the winners. So you need to intercept these people the minute they come into the office in the morning. Do not let them turn their laptops on. Do not let them take their coat off and greet their team and get wind that you're going to do this. You need to intercept them and you need to cut them out from the herd, completely non-agile in the way that we're talking about this. Break the system, so it's quite harsh. Pick them up, move them physically. But you need a planned activity and it needs to be fun. This does not need to be a punishment for your team member who is being dead for the day, who's won the lottery. You need to find somewhere for the winners to hang out. If you leave your team member in situ, in their usual place, they will help. We have spent years conditioning these people to do the right thing. People who are in development and testing, as a general rule, don't do it for any reason other than they love to solve problems. And they want to solve the problem that was bugging them last night because they didn't finish it yesterday. They will naturally drift back to do their day job. They will overhear their team in trouble and they will want to help, which is great normally. But for this, it breaks our test. You also need the knowledge and the backing of the business. Your velocity is likely to be hit. Your throughput, your output of product to code to live is likely to be hit. So you have to give them a bit of warning. You need them on board to understand this is about making sure that we're better for the long term for a short amount of pain today. And the other thing it needs to be is top secret, because if they get wind of this, they will mitigate. So they will suddenly, any bad behaviours they've got, it's like going on holiday. They'll go, well, I'll just pack up my staff, check the code in, make sure I've handed over all the things that we've been testing them and training them to do for the years and years and years that we've been working with them. What we need to do is say, no, this is a test. It's a pop quiz. You're not supposed to have notice. Doesn't it? It sounds awful. Why would you do this to a team? Your team is there going to be looking very sad, having a missing member. So, the things that this team, in my experience, say, we're an Agile team. People will say this, we're an Agile team. In that case, it should be easy to change your behavior to a certain extent. You should be able to adapt. That's what it means to be Agile. We are cross-functional. Then your missing team member will be able to cover their work. We'll be able to cover the work of the missing team member. Maybe not as well as he or she can, but we should be able to cover it a little bit. We understand what the team is working on at any one point in time. Yeah, because the product owner is still going to be expecting what the product owner expects. It's not like, you know, the business rules go away. It's just that it might take a bit longer. We're a man down, person down. Our developers pair work. Then your missing team member will have been pairing. And by developer, where I work, we use developers for developers and testers. It's because we treat them exactly the same. Your missing team member should have been pairing, whether they've been pairing with testers or developers. Someone somewhere should know what's going on with that particular piece of work. Your developers will know, if we've taken a tester out of the team, your developers will know what was going on and how to test that story. It's okay that they won't do as good or as thorough a job, but it shouldn't stop work. And we check in code frequently. Great, so there won't be a big chunk of code for a story that we haven't actually got in progress. And this is what you hear. We weren't ready. You didn't give us time. We needed to prepare. How many people really think it's reasonable to prepare for a crisis? I mean, you know, we don't get that choice. That's the luxury that we're trying to test here. So, my first question to you. How do you think your teams would do?
It would be chaos.
Do you think so?
I think at the start, if we do it the first time, everyone was like, what are you doing? Why are you taking my developers?
Okay, anyone else?
They would just go and do nothing.
Do you think so? So you lost one person for 2 weeks, they would do nothing?
Well, they will achieve nothing.
So I had been working with these teams for a long time, and I reckoned they would do about 60%. That's not a measure, that's just a mark out of 10, you know, 6 out of 10. Congratulations, you scored 6 out of 10. And that's what I'd thought. And they schooled me, actually, but I'll tell you why later. The 6 out of 10 was what I thought. I had a perception that they knew the habits, but they weren't as diligent with them as I had hoped they would be. So, how do you think we did? So, as an experiment, I've explained to you what we'd need to do, how it would be run. How do you think we did?
Better than you thought.
Better than that. Anyone else? Okay. We didn't run this experiment. Now I know, that's anticlimax, isn't it? We didn't run this experiment. Why do you think we didn't run this experiment?
Because it was very difficult to quantify the business case for it and get approved.
That is a good reason why we didn't run it. That's not the reason, but it's a good one. The cost is another. Anyone else?
Backlash.
Sorry?
Maybe a backlash.
Backlash, that's another good one. We had opportunity cost. Right now is a really bad time for us. The reason we didn't run it is because I went running around saying, we need to do death sims, because at this point I hadn't renamed it. And I got some encouragement from the senior managers, actually. It was like, yeah, it's a great idea, just not right now. And the reason they said not right now is because actually, to be fair, we were moving offices in about 6 weeks, and we had this absolutely immovable deadline, and they said, we really, really, really can't do this now. Wait till later, and we'll talk about it. So it wasn't a commitment, but they were committed to the idea, and I was quite pleased. So going back to my thing here, the story arc I had is I had this idea and something happened. Now, I've told you my idea, and something did happen. Now, at the Christmas party, as is all things at the Christmas party, I was talking with a guy called Kevin Harris, who's one of our testers, and it turns out he and I were both planning to talk about the same event, about the same thing, and our talks overlapped just a tiny bit. And because he's smarter and funnier than me, I have stolen his next slide, which is why it looks completely different. Just warning you in advance. He knows. He said it's okay. But we had this event, and in his talk, he'll talk. If you get to see Kevin talk, do go and see it. We had this event, and as Kevin says, it doesn't actually matter what happened. We had a dramatic event. This thing happened. So I'd had the idea, and then this thing happened. Now, it could have been any one of these or 1,000 other really stupid reasons why. And in Kevin's talk, he actually says it doesn't matter what happens. Now, I am curious, and if I was sat in your position there, I would want to know what this event was. So you can probably see from here, there's one that's obviously far more likely than all the others. So that's the one we're going with. And here's the thing. We lost 4 testers overnight. We came in one morning and we were 4 testers down. And there was no handover, there was no opportunity to just tidy things up. It was just gone. And this something had happened. Now, do you remember this? Can I just say, I told you so, because, you know, I just feel I've got to do. We did know that this could happen, but it was a low risk. Just because it's a low risk does not mean it won't happen. The impact is the thing that we should be looking at. So, that's about 60%. Who wants to know how it actually went in live? We were running this test for real in production suddenly. So we didn't run the experiment, but we did run it in live. No safety net. So I said 60%. I thought the guys had scored 6 out of 10. And here's the thing. They did better than that. They did astoundingly well. Our testers got together as a community, took themselves off into a room, looked at all the work, prioritized it, took the most important work and made sure that it was covered, assessed and either dropped or shelved work that was less important. They built themselves a community. They built themselves a safe space to complain and bitch and moan on all the things that they felt they needed to do. And then they came out of that room and they provided a united front to the business, who was also feeling somewhat shocked and surprised and caught off guard. And they set about reorganizing themselves to cover all the teams that needed help. And they did an astounding job. And I am genuinely humbled that I could ever have thought that they would not be able to do this. So Agile development work, Agile practices is about practices. It's about habits, forming habits. And I had doubted the degree to which those habits had taken hold in general in the teams I worked with. And that was because I was further away from the teams than I would like to have admit. And what happened was I got to see for real just how well they could do. Now, okay, adrenaline helped a little, but actually they did exactly the right thing in exactly the right way to the best of their ability and just got on with it. And that, to me, I think is much better. I reckon 9 out of 10. I'd give them 10, but I don't know. It's a random number. The point is I was massively out, and we'd run this experiment in live without our safety net. So this is the original graphic that was taken from the blog post that I wrote when I was very disheartened in the 6 weeks before we moved offices, and I said, this is a really great idea, and God damn it, they won't do it. You know, okay, we are moving offices and it's reasonable, but even so, it's still a good idea and we should do it. the story of what happened next, I think, is the key bit. And this talk has been deliberately shortened to give you the opportunity to ask questions. What would you like to know?
Did they do any other simulations after that?
No, we haven't. Now, I have been asked before if I would run it again, and we can't run it yet. So it's all still a little bit too new. So maybe 18 months, 2 years on, so another 18 months or a year from now, it won't be so bad, and it would be a good time to remind people of why we have these practices. And of course, you need the company to have changed, so the people who are there now may not be the same people who are there, all of them, in a year's time. So we need to make sure that we've maintained the habits for all the new people as part of the culture.
I love the idea of a team coming up with their own death sims, like putting them on 3x5 cards or whatever, as you have ideas, and then randomly running something. Yeah.
That's actually what I'm planning to do in Spa next month. So yeah, exactly that. Give it a go.
And making it more about the team having some kind of consent in this, rather than I could totally get the for it to be as meaningful as possible, it needing to be top secret. But it's a real kind of thing to do to them, isn't it?
It is. It's a bit scary.
What if we up the death schemes to real crisis? The reason why I'm asking is I'm working for a company that is constantly having real death.
Yes.
Yeah. So we constantly have IT outage, constantly server breaks, and then all software that nobody knows code stop working.
You're not. Yeah. It's too.
What do we do when we're not being simulated, but it actually happens on a weekly basis?
You're solving the wrong problem. So your problem is not that you don't know how well your habits are embedded. It's that you haven't solved your fundamental problem. So you should be doing like 5 whys and constantly improving the system. Your system needs to look like it's perfect, or not perfect, but it needs to look like it's doing okay so that you can then test it. Because if it's not doing okay regularly, fix those problems first, or at least make them much better, because it's, you don't want to add stress. Not that bad.
Yeah, do you have an idea? I mean, I know that the business said not now. So that was also I was saying, like, if I would do it now, there would be chaos because we have deadlines. We can't do it. It's not a good time. Do you have any idea how to convince the business?
Tell them this story. Tell them they can either. So it's the same question as when people say on a roadmap, we've got all this stuff to do by this deadline, and you say, well, either you can choose what we're not going to do, or we can all wait till the end and see. It can be a surprise. And that's what this was. It's a, you can either test it, or we'll see what happens when something drastic, and it doesn't have to be, it could be any event. It doesn't have to be a zombie apocalypse as it goes. It could be any event, but is that the point you want to be trying it for the first time? I learned, we were really lucky, and there are many reasons why we were really lucky.
So that's the key thing. It's that, because one argument would be, well, this happened to you for real, and look, everyone excelled and
Lucky.
Success story. But it's about being clear that actually you were lucky.
We were lucky. We were lucky because most of the testers had been there. We expanded. We hadn't had a lot of attrition, so our churn rate of developers and testers in development was something like 2% or something really, really low over the last 5 years. So the testers who were there had been there for a really long time. So coming together and redistributing themselves, they had the skill set to do that. They may not have been in a different product area for a long time, but they knew enough and they knew the principles. You couldn't have done that if all your staff were less than a year old. So
how big was the team to lose 4 testers?
Okay, so we have probably 12 development teams, and we probably have 5 or 6 ops teams, and each development team is made up of somewhere between about 5 and 8 people, including one tester, usually one tester.
So testers were shared across?
Sometimes, yeah. But there's lots of automation, so we have lots of automated testing. Our habits were really good. So it's exploratory testing that they do.
So the thing is, due to the luck that you had when it happened in production, do you find it's now going to be a harder sell to try and put it to
Yeah, it's a really good, interesting question.
I would think that any business would want to be more resilient, any company or
But
any
they will,
CEO,
that's-
yeah.
But is that going to happen again?
Last time and have the
Yes.
change.
Yeah.
Have we still got the same continuity of people? Am I in the same situation now as I was when we were lucky last time? And in which case, if I am, would I want to spend money?
Absolutely. And I can see myself standing in front of the CEO or whatever saying, how lucky are you feeling? Are you feeling lucky? Do you want to do this again? Shall we see?
The other one, I'm full of hope, so I'll go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would expect, there to be a cost-benefit analysis and for people to say, do you know what, actually, it's quite an expensive experiment to run. So don't get me wrong, I understand that.
And it's not a single experiment, because obviously you lost 4 testers. That's one scenario. What happens if you've lost 3 testers and a developer, 4 developers?
Yeah, absolutely.
6 developers, but all in one team.
Half
All
the
that sort of
teams,
stuff.
half the teams, budget cuts.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could be anything. Yeah, exactly. And it does happen. And the question is what, how can your team survive? How can your company survive? Because it's not just the people who went and their absence, it's also the fact that you've got the morale from the rest of that team to deal with. For whatever reason those people left, you've got to deal with that. And that's going to have an impact as well. And what you want is to still put product live. You still have customers. You still have deadlines. You still have all the things that you have.
What was the feedback from the people that did the experiment?
Very stressed.
It was an unpleasant time. It was quite dark, but at the same time there was that adrenaline. So there was a lot of reverting to the same culture as we'd had 3 or 4 years earlier when we were much more start-up-y. So you could feel that, do you know what? Doesn't matter about the rules, doesn't matter about just deal with the now, deal with the problems that we have today in the best way that we can. And being able to have people of a caliber and of the habits that knew that was okay. It was okay to stop doing some stuff, and they chose for themselves what was important and what wasn't. So there was a lot of autonomy in that. And then they went and they offered their services so we had testing as a service, effectively, to the development teams. And the testers were phenomenal. I just can't speak highly enough of them.
I think it's a fantastic idea and real food for thought. I was having and seeing the value of it. But I was thinking as well, again, an environment presently which feels a lot like yours, and we're having these quite frequent real
outages,
dramas and outages. But I thought a positive benefit of this idea for us and people in that situation is actually as a way of getting something positive from those live outages. So it's not, again, the opportunity for us to say, look, what we've been. I know this seems bad, but what we've been given here is an opportunity to learn from these situations.
And what you need to do is you need to have a really healthy approach to things like 5 whys. So you should be doing these, and we run basic training courses within the company. So I've written and delivered basic training courses on 5 whys, and then we do a much more advanced training course on 5 whys about how to ask the right sort of questions, why some questions are more useful than the others. And it's really, really important about making it not about the blame, because you cannot take the learnings away if everybody's scared. And that, if you've got constant outages, that using that mechanism to make sure that problems that you have, that you get to the root cause and that you fix it as fast as possible, if you can.
I think that the tool you've given us is, I will be telling this story or something. So when next time something bad happens live, I'll be saying, great. What we've got now is a chance. We've been gifted the opportunity that you weren't given the chance to do, which was to see what happens when see how good we are at coping with bad things happening. And I can tell them the story of, because there's this exercise called death sims, which you would probably never let us do, but it's okay because we've just got one. We can solve that, see what happens, and this is why we need to learn from all these opportunities using the techniques.
And don't forget, this is just our experience, my experience. This is just a story about his one I tried earlier, so you don't have to. This was, I had this really great idea. I didn't know at the point that we went through this, I didn't make the connection I needed to get several months down the road before I suddenly went, oh my God, we just ran this for live. I was too close to it. I still needed some time to go before I could look back and go, oh, look, there's a thing we've learned. And I think that's the same for many people. When you're actually in the weeds, it's really hard to do this kind of stuff. And it's really hard to see the benefit. And I think as coaches, that is one of the things that you are most valuable to do, is that slight separation from what's going on, the actual work, because this is the stuff where the value is, if you can see it, but you need to be slightly separated from it.
A couple of quick points which are quite interlinked. The first thing is, you rightly said, you need to have the habits in place.
You do.
So you need to have automation, TDD, pair programming.
I was testing those habits, absolutely. Or trying to.
And the other thing is, if you're in constant firefighting, there is no time to
Practice those habits, no.
Yeah, so I think you need to get to the place where you actually have some really good habits, and then you can test.
I was going to say, do you think they always had those good habits?
No.
I've worked at this company for 4 years. Habits take a long time to form, and exactly, you don't, you do. The more start-uppy you are, the more likely you are to have instability, frequently changing ground upon which you're standing. And that's okay, because you need to be constantly improving. That's all we ask, is to be a little bit better tomorrow than we were yesterday. But when you think you've got it, okay, well, how good are we? Because you can't. My problem was, and I was wrong, I just need to say that very clearly, I thought the guys have got these habits, they know what they're supposed to be doing, but I don't know they always do it. I bet they usually do it, and the word usually in a sentence really distresses me. So we usually do story writing, we usually do acceptance criteria, but we didn't do it for that one because we didn't really need it. And the usually word means, nah, I can do it if I bothered. And I was concerned, and I had this big bee in my bonnet about the fact that I thought, and I was wrong, that people were usually doing things and not always doing it. And the thing is, you can't tell someone, because somebody who says they usually do it but don't always, genuinely believe that actually mostly they do it. So you can't say, do you know what, your habits aren't as good as they are, you have to consciously do it. Habit is something you just do every single day, and you don't think about it. And for me, that was the big thing, was this idea of, actually, you really need to give it a go. You need to give it a try and test it, because if, as I suspect, you don't do it, I can only tell you that after I've demonstrated. And so in many ways, this was a little ego trip for me to go, look, see, I told you so. And actually, it turns out that I was wrong. And yeah, they did tell me so. They schooled me good. And I'm so proud of that, because it means that their habits were way better than I thought. And I've learned lots about the fact that I was nowhere near as close to the teams as I had thought I was. So as I said, we'd grown. And because we'd grown and we were growing, I'd originally been really close to all the teams. But we'd grown and teams had fractured and got split into 2 teams. And so we gradually spread out. And I still thought I had my finger on the pulse. And actually, it turns out not as close as I thought. And yeah, you need to be close or you don't really know what's going on. And, you can teach people these habits, you can't make them learn. And what I was so proud of was the fact that actually they just self-organised, and that was just a beautiful moment in a dark time.
It feels to me like, again, one experience I'm reminded of through your story is, back with 9/11, so for my sins, I was working with Lean Brothers back then, and obviously the human tragedy was unimaginable, but still, from this side of the Atlantic, it was a case, right, well, business goes on, and right now there's the task of recovering and all of that. And again, when the chips are down like that, the titanic effort by people who really show their commitment to making things work is extraordinary. And people talk about things like broken societies and what have you, and yet you see when disaster happens, that's when people really come together and you see the strength of the connections between people. So it's a good
A long time ago, I used to work for a company that was very close to a helicopter manufacturing place. And one of our risks on our risks and issues log was that a helicopter would crash on top of the call center, on top of the IT department, on top of something. it was actually a reasonably real risk. They were testing brand new helicopters, a mile and a half or whatever it was from where we were. It's not everybody's risk, is it? Most people don't have that as a risk. The whole 9/11 stuff, it could have been on someone's risks and issues log, but dear Lord, you're never going to think that that's going to happen. So the problem with all these things, like when you're sending astronauts up into space, is it's probably not going to happen. And that's the thing. How do you train people for things that you can't imagine happening? Because they have to be able to deal with stuff. And at the end of the day, it's your habits, the things that you always do, because you revert to whatever your habits are when you're under pressure. So we all are really, really good at healthy eating and exercise and all the rest of it for 2 days at a time, but making it a habit is really difficult. And human beings, rewiring our brains is really hard. I love it. This is the stuff I love. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. It's quite warm in here now, so thank you.